The heavy oak doors of the Costello Estate's master suite slammed shut, the metallic click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot. Leora was finally locked inside with the most feared man in the American Northeast. Noah Costello was a ghost in the underworld, a ruthless mafia boss whose name was whispered in blood and corporate boardrooms alike. She stood trembling in her $60,000 silk wedding gown, expecting cruelty, violence, or worse. She closed her eyes as his heavy footsteps approached, bracing for the nightmare her own father had sold her into. But when Noah finally acted, what he did didn't just shatter her expectations, it blew her entire reality wide open, shocking everyone who thought they knew the monster of Manhattan. To the outside world, the Dempsey family was a pillar of Boston's high society. Arthur Dempsey, Leora's father, was a titan of the Atlantic shipping industry, a man who hosted charity galas and dined with senators. But behind the velvet curtains of their Beacon Hill mansion, the Dempsey empire was rotting from the inside out. Leora Dempsey, at 24, was an art restorer who preferred the quiet company of oil canvases and turpentine to the glittering, superficial world her father inhabited. She was fiercely independent, having moved into a small loft in Brooklyn to escape the suffocating expectations of her family. But you can never truly outrun your blood. It was a rainy Tuesday in November when Leora's world fractured. She had been summoned to her father's corporate office at Dempsey Shipping headquarters, a rare occurrence. When she pushed open the frosted glass doors of his penthouse suite, she didn't find her father reviewing quarterly reports. She found him on his knees. Standing over Arthur were three men. Two were built like brick walls, their tailored suits struggling to contain the sheer mass of their shoulders. But it was the third man who made the air in the room turn to ice. Noah Costello. Even Leora, disconnected from the city's darker currents, knew that name. At 32, Noah was the head of the Costello syndicate. He didn't run street corner rackets. He ran politicians, union bosses, and multi-billion-dollar supply chains. He possessed a terrifying elegance, sharp jawline, raven dark hair, and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He radiated a cold, calculated stillness that was far more intimidating than any overt display of anger. "Ah, Leora," Noah said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't look at her like a predator looks at prey. He looked at her like a mathematician looking at the final variable in a complex equation. "What is going on here?" Leora demanded, her voice betraying a slight tremor as she rushed to her father's side. "Dad, get up. Who are these people?" Arthur Dempsey didn't look at his daughter. His face was ashen, slick with terrified sweat. "Leora, please, just listen to Mr. Costello." Noah calmly walked to Arthur's mahogany desk, picking up a leather-bound ledger. "Your father," Noah began, his tone conversational, "has a gambling problem. Not the kind that involves casinos or racehorses. The kind that involves leveraging his entire shipping fleet to move narcotics for the Volkov Bratva. Unfortunately for Arthur, he lost a shipment worth $60 million. The Volkovs don't send collection notices, Leora. They send undertakers." Leora stared at her father, nausea rising in her throat. "Is this true?" Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic whimper escaping his lips. "The Volkovs demanded payment," Noah continued, tossing the ledger onto the desk with a heavy thud. "And since your father's accounts are completely drained, he offered them the only asset he had left of any value. You." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Leora felt the blood drain from her face. "He sold me?" "But," Noah said, stepping closer to Leora, his towering frame casting a shadow over her, "I have a vested interest in the ports your father controls. I cannot have the Russians gaining a foothold in my territory. So, I paid your father's debt, I bought the ports, and, by extension of the contract your father signed." Noah pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner jacket pocket and held it out to her. "I bought you." Leora's hands shook as she took the paper. It was a legally binding marriage contract, drafted with terrifying precision, bearing her father's frantic, messy signature. "You're insane," Leora whispered, stepping back. "I won't do it. This isn't the Dark Ages. You can't just buy a wife." Noah's expression remained entirely impassive. "You are free to walk out that door, Leora. But if you do, the Costello family's protection ends at the elevator bank. The Volkovs have men waiting in the lobby. They don't want to marry you. They want to put you in a shipping container bound for Eastern Europe to work off $60 million, one nightmare at a time." He checked the gold Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. You have 60 seconds to decide. Put on the ring, become a Costello, and you live. Walk away, and you belong to the wolves. Leora looked at her father, who was still weeping on the carpet, refusing to meet her gaze. The betrayal was a physical ache in her chest, sharp and agonizing. She was entirely alone. Taking a shaky breath, she looked back at Noah Costello. His icy blue eyes offered no comfort, no warmth, just a brutal, pragmatic reality. "I'll marry you," she choked out, a single tear cutting a track down her cheek. "Good," Noah said, turning his back on her instantly. "The wedding is Saturday. Pack your things." The next 4 days were a blur of terrifying efficiency. Leora was relocated from her cozy Brooklyn loft to a fortress-like penthouse in Manhattan. She was measured, poked, and prodded by a small army of silent tailors and stylists. She had no phone, no internet, and no contact with the outside world. Her only companion was Maria, an older, stern-faced housekeeper who spoke little but watched Leora with eyes full of a strange, silent pity. When Saturday arrived, it felt less like a wedding day and more like an execution. The ceremony was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral. The grandeur of the soaring Gothic arches and the magnificent stained glass only heightened Leora's sense of imprisonment. She was encased in a custom Vera Wang gown, its heavy silk and intricate lace feeling like a beautiful, suffocating straitjacket. As the massive wooden doors opened and the organ music swelled, Leora began her walk down the aisle. Her father was not there to give her away. Noah had explicitly forbidden it, citing Arthur's stench of cowardice. Instead, Leora walked alone. The pews were packed, but this was no ordinary congregation. These were the power players of the criminal underworld and the corrupt politicians who enabled them. Men with sharp suits and sharper scars evaluated her as she passed. Women draped in diamonds whispered behind gloved hands. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, incense, and underlying danger. At the end of the aisle stood Noah. He was breathtaking in a bespoke black tuxedo, his posture impeccably straight. Yet, he looked entirely out of place in a house of God. As Leora approached the altar, her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected to see a victor's smirk on his face, the smug satisfaction of a man who had successfully conquered his prize. Instead, Noah looked tense. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle ticking in his cheek. When he took her hand to help her up the final step, his grip was firm, his skin unexpectedly warm against her freezing fingers. The priest's words washed over Leora in a meaningless drone, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, till death do us part. Given the life expectancy in Noah's line of work, that last vow felt particularly ominous. "I do," Noah said. His voice echoed through the massive cathedral, carrying a weight of absolute finality. "I do," Leora whispered, her voice barely carrying past the priest. Noah slid a heavy platinum band onto her finger. It was encrusted with a diamond so large it felt like an anchor. The priest pronounced them husband and wife and gave the customary instruction to kiss the bride. Leora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, bracing for a brutal, dominating kiss meant to show the assembled crowd who owned her. But it never came. Instead, Noah leaned in, his lips barely brushing the corner of her mouth, a ghost of a kiss, respectful and shockingly restrained. As he pulled back, he leaned close to her ear, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Keep your head up, Leora. Show them no fear. The hard part is about to begin." His words sent a new spike of adrenaline through her veins. What could be harder than marrying a monster? The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, entirely bought out for the Costello family. It was a lavish display of power and wealth. Champagne flowed like water, and the tables groaned under the weight of gourmet feasts. Leora sat beside Noah at the head table, a porcelain doll on display. Throughout the night, Noah's underbosses and captains approached the table to pay their respects. They kissed Leora's hand, offering congratulations with cold, assessing eyes. Among them was Silvio the Snake Moretti, one of Noah's oldest capos. Silvio looked at Leora with a greasy, unsettling hunger. "A beautiful bride, boss," Silvio purred, his eyes lingering on Leora's décolletage, Arthur Dempsey's little girl. "I must say, when we acquired Dempsey's debts, I didn't realize the collateral was so exquisite." Leora felt sick, but she remembered Noah's whisper. Show them no fear. She forced her spine straight and met Silvio's gaze coldly. Noah's hand suddenly clamped onto Leora's knee under the table. To the room, he looked relaxed, sipping his scotch. But Leora could feel the terrifying tension in his grip. Watch your eyes, Silvio, Noah said, his voice soft, almost a purr. They are staring at my wife. I would hate to have to carve them out of your skull before dessert. Silvio paled, stepping back quickly. Apologies, boss. No disrespect intended. Enjoy the party, Silvio. Noah dismissed him. As the hours dragged on, the dread in Leora's stomach metastasized. The reception was ending. The guests were leaving. Soon, she would be alone with him. Soon, the vows of a captive would be called due. A sleek black bulletproof Maybach transported the newlyweds from the plaza to the Costello estate, a sprawling, heavily fortified compound in upstate New York. The drive took over an hour, and neither of them spoke a single word. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with unspoken threats and terrifying anticipation. When they arrived, the massive iron gates swung open, revealing a stone mansion that looked more like a medieval fortress. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes cutting through the fog. Noah led Leora inside, past vaulted ceilings and priceless antiquities, straight toward the grand staircase. He didn't take her to a guest room. He took her directly to the master suite. He opened the heavy oak door and gestured for her to enter. Leora walked into the room, her silk gown trailing softly over the Persian rug. The room was massive, dominated by a king-sized four-poster bed that looked terrifyingly large. Noah stepped inside and shut the heavy oak doors. Click. The deadbolt slid into place. Leora backed away until her spine hit the cold glass of the balcony doors. She was trapped. She watched as Noah took off his suit jacket, tossing it over a leather armchair. He slowly loosened his silk tie, unbuttoning the top of his crisp white shirt. Every movement was deliberate, powerful. Leora's breathing grew shallow. This was it. This was the moment the monster claimed what he bought. I won't fight you, Leora said, her voice shaking violently. You bought me. You own me. Please, just get it over with. Noah stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since she met him, the icy facade cracked. A flash of profound anger crossed his features, but it wasn't directed at her. You think I brought you here to rape you, Leora? He asked, his voice harsh, laced with disgust. Leora flinched. What else am I to you? I'm collateral. You are my wife, Noah corrected sharply. He walked over to a massive steel safe embedded in the wall behind a painting. He spun the dial with practiced speed, pulled the heavy door open, and reached inside. When he turned back around, he wasn't holding lingerie, and he wasn't undressing. He was holding a thick manila folder and a matte black Glock 19 handgun. Leora gasped, pressing herself harder against the glass. Noah walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He placed the heavy handgun onto a glass coffee table between them. Then, he tossed the manila folder beside it. Open it, he commanded. Leora stared at the gun, then at the folder. Her hands trembling uncontrollably, she reached out and picked up the file. She flipped it open. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer logs, and photographs. The first photograph was of her father, Arthur Dempsey, shaking hands with a man covered in Russian prison tattoos. The second photograph made Leora's heart stop. It was a picture of Leora, taken secretly. She was walking out of a coffee shop in Brooklyn. Superimposed over her image was a price tag and a set of coordinates. Your father didn't just owe the Volkovs money, Leora, Noah said, his voice deadly quiet. He didn't lose a shipment of drugs. That was a lie to get you to comply. Leora looked up, her vision blurring with tears. What? Arthur Dempsey is a parasite, Noah spat. 2 years ago, your mother didn't die of a sudden aneurysm. She was poisoned. Arthur found out she was going to divorce him and take her half of the shipping empire, the half that belonged to her family, not his. He killed her. No, Leora sobbed, dropping the folder. No, you're lying. Look at the coroner's report on page 3. Independent autopsy I paid for, Noah said. After he killed her, Arthur forged documents to seize her assets. But your mother was smart. She put a massive offshore trust in your name, one that unlocks on your 25th birthday, next month. Leora's mind was spinning, unable to process the magnitude of the horror. Arthur tried to access it and failed. Noah continued pacing the room. He went into massive debt trying to bribe offshore regulators. When he ran out of money, he turned to the Volkovs. But he couldn't pay them back. So he made a deal with them. He sold you to the Volkov human trafficking ring for a fraction of what he owed. He planned to report you kidnapped, declare you legally dead in a few years, and absorb your trust fund as your next of kin. The room tilted. Leora's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the edge of the sofa, burying her face in her hands. The man who raised her, the man she loved, had murdered her mother and sold her to be a slave. Why? Leora whispered, looking at Noah through her tears. Why are you telling me this? Why did you step in? Noah walked over and sat on the coffee table directly in front of her. He looked down at the gun. Because my mother was taken by men like the Volkovs when I was a boy, Noah said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, carrying a pain so deep it was almost tangible. She was sold. I never saw her again. I made a vow that no woman in my city would ever suffer that fate as long as I had breath in my lungs. He picked up the Glock and held it out to her. Grip first. Your father sold you to monsters. I stepped in and bought your contract to get you out of their hands. The only way to legally, unequivocally protect you in this world, to make sure the Volkovs couldn't touch you without starting a war with the Costello family, was to make you my wife. Leora stared at the gun in his hand, then up at his eyes. The terrifying Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who carried the weight of the world, a man who had chosen to play the monster to fight actual demons. Take it, Noah urged softly. If you still believe I am the villain of your story, if you believe I am going to hurt you, pick up the gun and put a bullet in my chest. You can take my car and my money, and you can disappear. Leora's hand shook as she reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the weapon. She looked at Noah Costello, the man who had hijacked her life, terrified her, and forced her into marriage. But he was also the man who had just saved her from a fate worse than death. She didn't take the gun. Instead, her hand moved past it, her fingers gently wrapping around Noah's wrist. And if I don't shoot you, she whispered, the tears finally stopping. Noah exhaled, a ragged, heavy breath that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. Then tomorrow, Leora Costello, we go to war. We destroy the Volkovs. And we make your father pay for what he did to your mother. Leora looked into his winter ocean eyes, the fear in her chest completely evaporating, replaced by something entirely new, a burning, righteous fire. Okay, she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. Let's go to war. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Costello estate was harsh and unforgiving, much like the reality Leora awoke to. She hadn't slept in the massive four-poster bed. Instead, she and Noah had spent the entire night sprawled on the Persian rug, surrounded by the contents of the manila folder. The Vera Wang wedding gown lay discarded in the corner, a crumpled monument to a life she no longer recognized. She was now dressed in a pair of Noah's charcoal sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt, her hair tied back in a messy knot. Leora traced the signature on one of the offshore banking documents, a bitter taste flooding her mouth. It's a remarkably good forgery, she whispered, leaning closer to the parchment. But it's too heavy on the downstroke of the M. My mother had a tremor in her left hand during her final years. Her signatures from that period were feather light. Arthur didn't account for the tremor. He just copied an older signature from their joint tax returns. Noah watched her from the leather armchair, nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked exhausted, the shadow of a dark stubble coating his sharp jaw, yet his eyes were intensely focused. You have a dangerous eye, Leora. I restore 16th century Renaissance oil paintings. Noah. I spot microscopic inconsistencies in brushstrokes for a living, Leora said, her voice surprisingly steady. The weeping girl from the night before was gone, replaced by a woman running on adrenaline and a cold, crystallized need for vengeance. Arthur used the Cayman National Bank to set up the dummy corporation that funneled the Volkov's money. But look here. She pointed a slender finger at a routing number. He didn't use a secure dark pool transfer. He used a standard SWIFT code linked to Dempsey Shipping's secondary subsidiary in Delaware. It's a breadcrumb. Noah set his coffee down and moved to the floor beside her. His proximity no longer terrified her. It grounded her. He smelled of bergamot, espresso, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. If we can trace that specific Swift code, Noah murmured, his arm brushing against hers, we can prove Arthur is violating federal sanctions and money laundering for the Bratva. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division would seize his entire fleet by Tuesday. But that doesn't solve the Volkov problem, Leora pointed out, turning her head to meet his gaze. They were close enough that she could see the tiny flecks of silver in his ocean blue eyes. If Arthur goes to prison, the Volkovs still lose their 60 million, and they will still come after me to recoup the loss. A piece of paper from the SEC won't stop Russian assassins. No, Noah agreed, his expression hardening into the ruthless mask of the boss. It won't, which is why we aren't going to the FBI. We are going to bleed them dry. He stood up, crossing the room to a heavy mahogany desk, and pressed a button on a secure intercom. Dante, bring Leo up to the suite. We're moving. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. In walked Dante Rossi, Noah's imposing enforcer, built like a freight train, and Leo Bianchi, a man with a sharp, weasel-like face, clutching a encrypted tablet. They both stopped dead in their tracks upon seeing Leora sitting on the floor, surrounded by highly classified syndicate ledgers, wearing the boss's clothes. Boss? Dante asked, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Is there a problem? The problem is we've been looking at the board backward, Noah said, walking over to a digital map projected onto the far wall. Arthur Dempsey isn't the mastermind. He's the weak link. Leo, pull up the manifest for the Port of Newark, Terminal C. The one Dempsey controls. Leo typed furiously. Got it. Dempsey has a heavy freighter, the Atlantic Sovereign, docking at 0200 hours tomorrow morning. It's officially carrying agricultural machinery from Odessa. It's not machinery, Leora spoke up, rising to her feet. The two mobsters stared at her, stunned that she was speaking during a tactical briefing. Leora ignored their shock and walked over to the projection. Arthur never uses Terminal C for agriculture. The union dues there are too high, and the offloading cranes are outdated. He only uses Terminal C when he needs to bypass the standard Homeland Security X-ray protocols. He bribes the night shift harbor master, Thomas Gable. I used to do payroll for my father during my summer breaks. Gable's bonuses is triple his salary. Noah's lips curved into a predatory, breathtaking smile. She's right. The Volkovs are moving their next shipment through our backyard. Guns or heroin, it doesn't matter. It's worth millions. What's the play, Noah? Dante asked, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of violence. We hijack the Atlantic Sovereign tonight, Noah ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. We take the cargo, we burn the ship. We leave the Volkovs with nothing, and we leave Arthur holding the bag for a destroyed Russian shipment. By dawn, the Volkovs won't be hunting Leora. They'll be hunting her father. It's risky, Leo muttered, swiping on his tablet. Terminal C is heavily fortified. The Russians will have their own Spetsnaz mercenaries guarding the offload. We go in there, it's a bloodbath. Then we bring a bigger bath, Noah replied coldly. Arm the men. Suppressed carbines, tactical gear. Dante, I want Silvio Moretti running the perimeter team. Leora felt a sudden chill at the mention of Silvio's name. She remembered the greedy, reptilian way he had looked at her at the wedding reception. Wait, she interrupted. The men turned to her again. Noah, Leora said, keeping her voice low but firm. I don't trust Silvio. When he spoke to me last night, he knew about my father's debts. He knew I was collateral. How did he know the specifics of my father's financial ruin, if this was a private deal between you and Arthur? Noah's eyes narrowed. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with sudden, dangerous implications. Dante and Leo exchanged a quick, tense glance. Silvio oversees the Brooklyn docks, Noah said slowly, processing the information. He has no business knowing the details of Dempsey's corporate ledgers unless he's been looking at them himself, or unless someone on the other side told him, a mole, Dante growled, cracking his knuckles. You think the snake is making side deals with the Russians? I think, Noah said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, that we are going to find out tonight. Tell Silvio he's leading the vanguard. If he's loyal, he does his job. If he's a traitor, he dies with the Russians. Noah turned back to Leora. You will stay here in the vault. The estate is impenetrable. Maria will stay with you. No, Leora said, her chin lifting defiantly. I am going with you. Leora, this isn't a boardroom negotiation. This is a cartel war. I know the port's logistical operating system, Leora countered, stepping directly into his personal space, forcing him to look down at her. The cranes, the shipping yard gates, the container manifest software it runs on Dempsey Shipping's proprietary network. If you go in guns blazing, the Russians will just lock down the terminal electronically and trap you in the kill zone. You need someone in the mobile command center to override the system and keep the exits open. I have Arthur's master administrative codes memorized. Noah stared at her, assessing her courage against her stubbornness. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the utter refusal to be a victim ever again. He reached out, his callous thumb gently brushing against her cheekline, a gesture of shocking tenderness amidst the talk of war. If you come, you stay in the armored SUV with Leo, Noah commanded. You do not step out of that vehicle. Understood? Understood, Leora breathed. The port of Newark at 2 a.m. was a desolate, towering cathedral of rust and steel. The air smelled of salt, diesel fumes, and decaying seaweed. A freezing, relentless rain lashed against the windshield of the black, armored Cadillac Escalade parked in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, overlooking Terminal C. Inside the SUV, Leora sat in the passenger seat, a glowing laptop balanced on her knees. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the screen and the array of tactical radios mounted on the dashboard. Leo sat in the driver's seat, an Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun resting across his lap, his eyes scanning the perimeter. They're moving, Leo whispered, pressing his earpiece. Through the rain-streaked window, Leora could see the massive, dark silhouette of the Atlantic Sovereign moored at the docks. Floodlights illuminated the cargo deck, where heavily armed men in black tactical gear were overseeing the offloading of unmarked shipping containers. I've tapped into the terminal's mainframe, Leora said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. I have control of the gantry cranes and the security gates. Good girl, Noah's voice crackled through the secure radio channel. He was out there in the dark, leading the assault team. Dante, status. In position, Dante's voice replied. Snipers have eyes on the Russian sentries. Silvio? Noah asked. There was a pause. Static hissed over the frequency. Silvio, report, Noah demanded, his tone sharpening. I'm here, boss, Silvio's voice finally chimed in, sounding breathless. Perimeter is secure. Moving to the designated choke point. Execute, Noah ordered. The chaos erupted instantaneously. Leora watched in horrifying awe as the shadows around the docks came alive. Suppressed gunfire spat brilliant white flashes in the gloom. The Russian sentries dropped before they could even sound the alarm. Noah's men moved with terrifying precision, sweeping through the shipping yard like a pack of wolves. They're taking the ship, Leo muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. It's working. Leora watched the monitors on her screen. Wait, she said, her blood running cold. Something is wrong. The manifest for the Atlantic Sovereign. It's empty. What do you mean empty? Leo snapped, looking at her screen. The containers they are offloading. The weight sensors on the cranes are registering 0. There's no cargo in them. They're hollow. Suddenly, the radio exploded with Dante's frantic voice. Boss! It's a trap! The containers are empty. The Russians aren't offloading, they're waiting in the shipyard. We are surrounded. The night erupted into deafening violence. The suppressed weapons were quickly drowned out by the roar of unsuppressed AK-47 automatic fire. The floodlights in the shipyard snapped on, blindingly bright, illuminating Noah and his men, trapped in the center of the loading zone. Dozens of Volkov foot soldiers poured out from between the stacked shipping containers, laying down a devastating field of crossfire. Silvio! Noah roared over the radio. Bring the perimeter team in! Flank them from the east! Sorry, boss. Silvio's voice came back, dripping with malicious glee. The Volkovs made me a better offer. Dempsey's ports, Costello's territory. All for me. Enjoy the bloodbath. The line went dead. That son of a bitch, Leo roared, throwing the Escalade into drive. I'm going down there. No, Leora screamed, grabbing his arm. If you drive into that kill zone, the armor won't hold against armor-piercing rounds. Look at the cameras. She pointed to the laptop screen. On the thermal imaging feed, she could see Noah and Dante pinned down behind a forklift, completely suppressed by heavy machine gun fire from a Volkov heavy gunner positioned on an elevated catwalk. They had seconds before they were overrun. Leora's heart hammered against her ribs like a jackhammer. She wasn't an assassin, she wasn't a mobster, but she was Leora Costello now. and she was not going to let a traitor and a pack of monsters take the man who had traded his freedom for her life. She slammed her hands onto the keyboard, bypassing the terminal's safety protocols. "What are you doing?" Leo shouted. "Playing God," Leora hissed. She accessed the control network for Gantry Crane 4, a massive, towering behemoth of steel that hung directly over the Russian heavy gunner's position. The crane was currently holding one of the empty 40-foot shipping containers suspended 60 feet in the air. With a few keystrokes, she overrode the magnetic locking mechanisms. "Noah! Dante! Cover your ears!" Leora screamed into the main radio channel. She hit the emergency release key. Outside, a metallic groan echoed over the gunfire. The massive steel cables snapped. The 40-foot shipping container dropped from the sky like a meteor. It slammed into the elevated catwalk with the force of a bomb. The earth-shattering crash drowned out the gunfire. The catwalk crumpled instantly, taking the Russian heavy gunner and 3 other Volkov soldiers down into a mangled heap of steel and concrete, throwing up a massive cloud of dust and debris that blinded the remaining Russians. "Move!" Noah's voice roared through the chaos. The momentary distraction was all the Costello men needed. Noah and Dante broke from cover, their weapons flashing as they decimated the disoriented Volkov line. Within 90 seconds, the courtyard was a graveyard of Russian mercenaries. Silence descended upon the docks, broken only by the hiss of the rain and the groaning of the destroyed catwalk. "Clear!" Dante's voice echoed over the radio, heavy with exertion. Leo let out a breath he had been holding for 2 minutes and looked at Leora. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, terror, and profound respect. "Holy hell, Mrs. Costello." Leora's hands were shaking so violently she could barely close the laptop. She pushed open the heavy armored door of the SUV and stepped out into the freezing rain. She walked toward the shipyard, her feet splashing in puddles of water and blood. Noah emerged from the smoke and shadows, his black tactical gear soaked, an assault rifle slung across his chest. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, but his eyes were locked onto hers. He didn't yell at her for stepping out of the vehicle. He didn't speak at all. He strode across the tarmac, closed the distance between them, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. Leora buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of cordite and rain, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He was alive. They had survived. "You saved my life," Noah whispered against her wet hair, his voice rough with emotion. Leora pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her expression hardening into the same ruthless determination that mirrored his own. "Silvio betrayed you," she said, the rain washing away the last remnants of her old life. "My father set the trap. We didn't get the cargo, Noah." Noah's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with a dark, lethal fire. He looked past her to the destroyed terminal. "We didn't come for the cargo, Leora," Noah said, his voice cold and resolute. "We came to find out who the enemies were. Now we know. Silvio thinks he won. Arthur thinks he's safe." Noah reached up, gently wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. "Let them sleep tonight, because tomorrow we burn their entire world to ash." The storm that ravaged the port of Newark had passed, but a different kind of hurricane was about to make landfall in Boston. At 9 a.m. on Monday, Arthur Dempsey sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk at Dempsey Shipping Headquarters on the 42nd floor of the Prudential Tower. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the crystal decanter of Macallan 25 he was currently pouring into 2 heavy tumblers. Across from him sat Silvio Moretti, his expensive suit rumpled, but his face split into a greasy, victorious grin. "To a new era," Arthur said, his voice slick with relief as he handed Silvio a glass. "The Volkovs are satisfied. Costello's men were decimated on the docks, and according to the police scanners, Noah himself hasn't been seen since the shootout. You'll have the Costello territory secured by the end of the week, Silvio, and my shipping lanes are finally mine again." "And your daughter?" Silvio asked, taking a deep swallow of the scotch. "The Russians will realize they didn't get their collateral." Arthur waved a dismissive hand, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni shirt. "Leora was a necessary casualty. If she perished in the crossfire with Costello, it simplifies my legal claim to her offshore trust. A tragic loss, of course, but business is business." "How touching," a voice echoed from the doorway. Arthur's Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the imported marble floor. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the penthouse suite had been pushed open. Standing in the doorway was Dante Rossi, holding a suppressed Heckler and Koch USP point blank against the temple of Arthur's head of private security. Dante casually shoved the unconscious guard into the hallway and stepped aside. Noah Costello walked into the room. He wasn't wearing the blood-soaked tactical gear from the docks. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, midnight blue Tom Ford suit, looking every inch the untouched, untouchable king of the Northeast. But it was the person who stepped out from behind him that made the blood drain entirely from Arthur Dempsey's face. Leora. She wore a tailored black trench coat over a sleek charcoal dress, her posture rigidly straight, her chin held high. The terrified, trembling girl who had been sold in this very room a week ago was dead. In her place stood Leora Costello. Leora, Arthur choked out, falling back into his leather chair. You're alive. Silvio sprang to his feet, reaching for the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. I wouldn't, Noah warned softly. The quiet menace in his tone froze Silvio mid-motion. Dante has a laser sight currently resting on your left kidney. You draw that gun, Silvio, and you'll be dead before the metal clears leather. Silvio slowly raised his hands, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. Noah, boss, let me explain. The Russians, they. Save it, Silvio, Noah interrupted, walking slowly toward the desk. I didn't come here to listen to the excuses of a dead man. I came here to let my wife handle her family business. Noah stepped back, yielding the floor to Leora. Leora walked to the edge of the desk, looking down at the man who had raised her. She felt no pity. She felt no heartbreak. The revelation of her mother's murder had burned away any residual love she held for him. You thought you were so clever, Arthur, Leora said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. You thought you could forge my mother's signature on the Cayman National Bank documents. You thought the Volkovs would do your dirty work, and you'd walk away a billionaire. Arthur stammered, gripping the edge of his desk. Leora, sweetheart, you have to understand. The pressure, the debts. I did what I had to do to save our legacy. You have no legacy, Leora stated coldly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive, tossing it onto the spilled scotch on his desk. What is this? Arthur whispered. At 6 a.m. this morning, Leora explained, I accessed the Dempsey shipping mainframe using your administrative codes. I bypassed your firewalls and forwarded the complete ledger of your transactions with the Volkov Bratva directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. I also sent copies to the SEC, the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and the New York Times. Arthur's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. You hacked my company? You gave them the ledgers? Leora, that's federal prison. For the rest of my life. Oh, the feds are the least of your problems, Arthur, Noah chimed in, leaning against the doorframe. You see, Leora also used your accounts to wire the remaining $60 million you owed the Volkovs directly into a decentralized cryptocurrency tumbler. The money is gone, untraceable. Why would you do that? Arthur screamed, panic finally shattering his polished facade. The Russians will kill me! That is exactly the point, Leora said, leaning down so she was eye level with him. You murdered my mother. You sold me to monsters. Now, you are going to know exactly what it feels like to be hunted by them. Sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound drifting up through the city streets, growing louder by the second. The FBI was arriving. As for you, Silvio, Noah said, turning his freezing gaze to his former captain. Silvio was trembling violently. Boss, please. I have money. I have territories. I'll give it all back. Just let me walk. Walk? Noah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm not going to kill you, Silvio. That would be too quick. Noah tossed a burner phone onto the floor at Silvio's feet. I sent the Volkovs the audio recording of you offering to sell out their heavy gunner at the docks to save your own skin. I also sent them the bank routing numbers showing you've been skimming 5% off their heroin imports for the last 3 years. Silvio dropped to his knees, staring at the phone as if it were a live grenade. No, Noah, they'll skin me alive. I suggest you start running, Noah said indifferently. Noah extended his hand toward Leora. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his grip. They turned their backs on the ruin of Arthur Dempsey and walked out of the penthouse suite. As the elevator doors closed, shielding them from the sound of Arthur's pathetic sobbing, Leora let out a long, shuddering breath. The war was over. The ghosts of her past were finally laid to rest. The return to the Costello estate in upstate New York felt entirely different this time. The oppressive, terrifying atmosphere that had choked Leora on her wedding night was gone, replaced by a profound sense of quiet and safety. A fierce snowstorm had blanketed the grounds, turning the fortress into a serene, isolated sanctuary. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearth of the master suite, casting warm, dancing shadows against the walls. Leora stood by the balcony glass, watching the snow fall over the pines. She was wearing one of Noah's oversized cashmere sweaters, holding a mug of tea. The television in the adjacent sitting room was muted, but the news ticker running across the bottom of the screen confirmed the day's events. Shipping magnate Arthur Dempsey indicted on federal racketeering and murder charges. Volkov syndicate implicated in massive financial seizure. Noah entered the room quietly, having just finished debriefing Dante and his lieutenants. The Costello family was secure. The power vacuum left by Silvio had been swiftly dealt with. Noah poured himself a glass of bourbon and walked over to Leora. He didn't touch her. He stood beside her, looking out at the snow. The silence between them was no longer fraught with tension. It was heavy with unspoken questions. "The offshore trust cleared this afternoon," Noah said softly, his voice a low rumble over the crackling fire. "The funds are entirely in your name, Leora. $300 million, clean and completely legal." Leora looked down at her tea, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "I know." Noah took a sip of his bourbon, his jaw tight. "You have your money. Arthur is locked away in a supermax facility where he can never hurt you, and the Volkovs are entirely focused on surviving the federal indictments. The threat is neutralized." He set his glass down on a side table and turned to face her. His icy blue eyes were unreadable, but there was a rigid tension in his shoulders. "Tomorrow morning, my lawyers will file the annulment papers," Noah stated. It wasn't a question, it was a surrender. The marriage was never consummated. It was entered into under duress. "The judge I own will push it through seamlessly. You will be Leora Dempsey again. Free." Leora stared at him. The man who ordered armies, who terrified the criminal underworld, was giving her the keys to her cage and stepping back so she could walk out. He was keeping the promise he made on their wedding night. She looked down at her left hand. The heavy platinum and diamond ring still rested on her finger, sparkling in the firelight. "What if I don't want to be Leora Dempsey anymore?" she whispered. Noah froze. His eyes locked onto hers, a sudden, fierce vulnerability cracking through his stoic mask. "Leora, don't play games with me. Not now. I am not a good man. I live in the dark. You don't belong in this world." "I survived this world," Leora corrected, stepping closer to him. "Because of you." She set her mug down next to his glass of bourbon. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her left hand and slid the massive diamond ring off her finger. Noah watched her, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The pain in his eyes was fleeting but unmistakable as she held the ring between them. He thought this was her goodbye. Instead, Leora reached out and placed the ring into the palm of his hand. "A week ago, my father forced you to put this on my finger to satisfy a debt," Leora said, her voice steady and clear, holding his gaze without a shadow of fear. "You did it to save a stranger. You bought a captive, Noah." She stepped directly into his space, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the familiar, intoxicating scent of bergamot and danger. "I don't want to be a captive," Leora whispered, looking up at his lips before meeting his eyes again. "And I don't want an annulment." Noah's breath hitched. "Leora, ask me," she demanded softly. "Don't tell me. Don't command me. Ask me." The hesitation in Noah vanished, replaced by a dark, consuming heat that made Leora's breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if she were the only light he had seen in decades. Slowly, he reached out, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face. His thumbs traced her cheekbones with a reverence that contrasted wildly with the violence he was capable of. "Leora," Noah murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he had buried long ago. "Will you stay with me? Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she breathed. Noah didn't hesitate another second. He slid the heavy platinum ring back onto her finger, locking it in place. Then, his hand slid into her hair, and he pulled her against him, capturing her lips in a kiss that shattered the last remaining walls between them. There was nothing gentle or restrained about it this time. It was a kiss fueled by a week of agonizing tension, surviving gunfire, and a desperate, undeniable claiming. Leora melted against him, her hands tangling in the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer as he backed her toward the massive four-poster bed. When they fell back onto the mattress, the cold, ruthless Mafia boss was gone. In the firelight, Leora gave herself to the man who had faced down monsters to keep her safe. She had expected a cage when she walked down the aisle. She had expected a tyrant. Instead, on the other side of the darkness, she had found her king. And together, they would rule the empire they had taken by force. Leora's story proves that sometimes the monsters we are taught to fear are the only ones capable of fighting the demons hiding in our own homes. What began as a terrifying transaction, a life traded for a shipping debt, transformed into a powerful tale of vengeance, loyalty, and an unbreakable bond forged in the fires of survival. Leora didn't just survive the Costello family. She became its queen, proving that true power isn't about the name you are born with, but the choices you make when the world forces your hand. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, we need you to join the family. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow fans of high-stakes drama and romance, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We drop thrilling, original stories every single week, and you won't want to miss what we have coming next. See you in the next one.